Welcome to Game Changers, where faculty members at the University of Texas offer Longhorn Network viewers an in-depth look inside their most innovative research. Zachary Elkins is an associate professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin, where he studies the design of constitutions. As a political scientist, his research has led him around the world to assist in the drafting of new constitutions. A recent collaboration with Google has led to the website Constitute, a searchable site that gathers the constitutions of every independent state in the world.
The American public is not going to stand by any president that crosses the U.S. Constitution, that's for sure. One of the strongest things you could say in American politics or in politics of some other countries is that's unconstitutional.
On this episode of Game Changers, Professor Elkins details the challenges of designing new constitutions and the reasons why our own Constitution endures.
My name is Zachary Elkins. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Government. I'm also a faculty associate here at the LILAS, the Latin American Studies Center here at the University of Texas. I've been interested in Latin America for quite a long time. During my undergraduate days, I was very interested in Central America, and this is the 1980s when politically Central America was on the map. But I became very interested in other parts of Latin America. I was actually born in Bogota, Colombia, and spent part of my years in Latin America. My dad was a sociologist and a Latin Americanist like me, so we traveled all over the place. By the time I started working on my dissertation at Berkeley, I had decided to spend a couple years doing field work in Brazil, looking at the seeds of the Brazilian Constitutional Assembly. I was very interested in how people lay down the foundations for democracy and how they build institutions, and a constitutional assembly is really a great laboratory to explore that. Brazil had been transitioning from an authoritarian government, which had been in power since the early 1960s. Brazil started to open up. They opened up their party system and allowed a little more contestation, a little competition in the political space. But by the 80s, people wanted even more than that. They wanted to actually vote for the chief executive, which is something actually Brazilian constitutions had not had. The president had always been indirectly elected. So there was this movement for what they call direita já, which is direct elections already now for the president. And that was really quite a large-scale movement. In all constitutional moments have this sort of fever. I think people recognize that they may not know what they do or how they do them, but they recognize that constitutions are important documents, and they see this as a moment to be involved. And so people were taking to the streets. They wanted to say in government, and this is no surprise. In the 1980s, people were coming out of the shadow of authoritarian governments in Latin America, Brazil included. They decided they wanted to christen this moment and build a new constitution to really mark this transition to democracy. So in 1987 and 88, they began a constitutional assembly, which lasted about a year and a half. It was highly participatory and built what is one of the most esteemed and certainly one of the longest constitutions on record. One thing that happened was that they solicited proposals from the public. I think there were about 60,000 proposals that filled boxes outside the Brazilian Congress. Whether or not they actually looked through them and how well they did, of course, is another question. We can be skeptical of that. But some of those proposals did find their way into the Constitution. This is a really critical moment, and it was a moment of transition from a very closed authoritarian society, so people were excited about the prospects for a new democratic, open society. People were on the streets talking about things. If you jumped into a taxi in Brasilia, you could talk about the ins and outs of presidentialism and parliamentarism with your taxi driver. People were actually talking about the Constitution, which is a miraculous thing, especially in a country which had very large numbers of illiterate citizens. And so this was very much a participatory constitution, and so it rightfully earned its name, the Citizens' Constitution. The Brazilian Constitution is widely admired in Brazil, and I know this only because I've gone and asked people on the street this one question, which is kind of a strange question in some ways, but I've asked them in one word, how would you describe the Brazilian Constitution?
Se você pudesse descrever a Constituição brasileira em uma palavra só, o que seria? obsoleto. Ela é boa, é boa, é boa, só boa. Progress.
The Brazilian Constitution has, in some ways, a very positive resonance in Brazil, and I think in part that's because the process was so participatory. And that's really important because, as I mentioned earlier, constitutions cannot enforce themselves. They really need the people to rise up. Brazil does have an extraordinary long document, and it is not only long, it's highly detailed on some issues that some of us wouldn't even think to even include in a constitution. So let's take sports. Brazil has 4 or 5 pages just on sports. They have a sports minister who, incidentally, the first one was Pelé, and they have all sorts of, in some ways, very specific provisions. There's a provision identifying what the interest rates should be. There's provisions identifying lower levels of government and how members in those lower levels will be selected. They didn't leave a lot to chance. Brazil's very detailed and perhaps overly detailed document is a product of its generation. If you're going to write a constitution in 1988, it's going to have a lot of social and economic rights that people wouldn't think to consider in 1787 when the U.S. founders sat down in Philadelphia to write their document. Is it just a different sense of what's important and what needs to be in a political document these days? I was very much interested in how democracy spreads across the world, and I've been thinking about this historically, looking back a couple hundred years, and it seemed to me that the easiest way to do that was to look discretely at a particular moment, and even more particularly to look at a document that came out of that moment. So that was in some ways why I wanted to look at constitutions, and the Brazilian Constitution, of course, was emblematic of their transition, and so in some ways nicely encapsulates their transition to democracy. But in thinking more about that, I became more and more interested in this process of writing constitutions. And what struck me about the Brazilian process is really how difficult it was to sit down with 500 people and write something. And you think about this when we put together major pieces of legislation like the Affordable Care Act or the Civil Rights Bill or whatever it is, you know it's a hard thing to do logistically, and of course the negotiation is even harder. But in constitutional assemblies, that is all on display and it's very public. And it became clear to me that these are people who could really use some help and use some resources. That was a place that at least outsiders could come in and add some value.
More from Professor Zachary Elkins on Game Changers in a moment.
Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had this long-standing debate about how long laws should endure. And Jefferson made this declaration in letter to Madison basically saying, you know what? All laws, including the Constitution, should self-destruct in 19 years. So he suggested that as a baseline, and you know, of course, Madison, who was involved in actually writing the Constitution, didn't like the idea of that. He saw some more virtues in stability. Jefferson's point is, you know, a powerful and a valid one in that there's some real issues in representation when constitutions last generation after generation. For example, let's think of slavery or even civil rights. In the 1950s, obviously, a majority of the people were happy in the South with Jim Crow laws, but the Constitution said something very different. And there was a moment where majorities would have run roughshod over those rights that were enshrined in the Constitution. Of course, there are many reasons why Madison's argument holds sway too. I mean, there's all sorts of virtues and stability. I mean, this Constitution has ruled us for 200 years. It's done something right. It's, a broad framework document, and it sets down a set of principles that we all, for the most part, agree with. That, in some ways, epitomizes the challenge for constitutions. This is just a basic issue of updating institutions as society evolves. Constitutions typically don't last that long. The median life expectancy of a constitution is 19 years. Thomas Jefferson recommended that constitutions only last 19 years. So the idea that, in fact, they only last 19 years is eerie. There's definitely a connection between the political, economic, and cultural events that occur in a country and what happens with its constitution. There's no doubt about it. Cataclysmic events such as wars and economic crises often result in new constitutions. On the other hand, it's not as tight a connection as you might think. There are enough crises that don't result in constitutions and enough constitutions that aren't the result of crises that it makes you wonder. And when you start thinking about those cases, you think, okay, what explains the rise of a new constitution? What leads one country to sit down and completely replace all of its laws, or at least its higher laws? Especially when, in some ways, that shakes up what little piece of stability a country might have. It's really interesting to think about whether the U.S. should write a new constitution or historically should have at critical moments in its past. So the Civil War, for example, set the nation on a very different path. And at the time, it was working under an agreement, a bargain, that was kind of a Faustian bargain to some degree. It had allowed slavery in a very prominent way in the Constitution. Now, what country would want slavery to have any part in its Constitution? And to put it another way, if you had a constitution that included aspects of slavery, wouldn't you want to rewrite it? I think in the United States, we're a country that really didn't have much of a history of our own before 1787. We're not a country that had, centuries and centuries of magisterial history and a coat of arms and a royal family. We didn't have these symbols that would bring us together. The Constitution is one of the few symbols that we have. And it really is one of the stronger symbols that brings us together as a country. You can suggest that, maybe this thing doesn't deserve the reverence it has, but you can also say, well, this reverence actually has some nice dividends. Because people are attached to it and because people know what it says, that means that those laws are observed. The American public is not going to stand by any president that crosses the U.S. Constitution, that's for sure. One of the strongest things you could say in American politics or in politics of some other countries is that's unconstitutional. And that has a power unlike any other. Most of the rights, probably with the exception of the one prohibiting the quartering of horses, that probably doesn't speak to too many Americans today. But for the most part, the other ones are reasonably universally appreciated. With some exceptions, of course. I'm thinking about the Second Amendment, which is something that people haven't really understood or even thought about too much because for most people it's irrelevant to their lives. And it was irrelevant in American society for about 200 years because it felt like a relic. It's not clear exactly what the founders meant, and you could argue it either way. One thing I wrote recently, which I still believe, we might clarify it, and we might actually provide some rights for gun owners, which say basically the government's not going to take your gun away. There is a right to bear arms, an individual right to bear arms, but also says that the government is going to make some necessary precautions in the interest of public security, public safety. Could we revise the Second Amendment? Could we actually do it practically and follow the Article 5 course of amending the U.S. Constitution to do so? I doubt it. What that would mean would be getting the current Congress on board, 2/3 of them, and then getting 3/4 of the states to sign off on that. I don't think it's going to happen, especially in this polarized climate. Take something that I think is perfectly consensual, like the Equal Rights Amendment. who wouldn't be in favor of providing or establishing very clearly equal rights for women? Well, apparently we are against that for whatever reason, and it's a procedural issue for the most part. We just couldn't get that through state legislatures. Of course, Congress was in favor of it, but it never got ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. So if something as consensual like that can't get through, how are we going to do something that does anything about the right to bear arms or anything else that might have more political implications? Let's think about, for example, the Affordable Care Act in 2012. This was an act obviously changing in many ways the economic and cultural and social fabric of the American people, and in ways that we haven't quite understood yet. But it's something that people were trying to do for years and years. I mean, this goes back to Roosevelt and then to LBJ and Nixon, all through, of course, Bill Clinton, and then again with Barack Obama. People have wanted to do something sensible about healthcare in this country because of rising costs, because of limited coverage, et cetera. We know all the problems, but haven't been able to establish anything that's even close to universal healthcare. In other countries, of course, it's been very easy to do so. And why has it been so hard here? Well, let's just think about a simple counterfactual. If we had, like most other countries, a right to health, is it the case that it would be very easy to write some legislation that establishes universal health care? Well, yeah, of course. We've talked about how powerful this mantra is of saying that's unconstitutional or that's constitutional. If we have marching orders from the Constitution saying everybody has a right to health, then in some ways it's very easy to make this logical jump to healthcare legislation that simply establishes that. I think the Founding Fathers, if you were to somehow connect with them today, would say, "What? You're still living by the document that we wrote that summer in 1787? What are you doing?" So I think that would be one reaction. On the other hand, I think they'd be pretty happy with the idea that the nation that they put together is somehow, in some way, still alive in that form.
We'll be back with more from Professor Zachary Elkins here on Game Changers.
When I was doing my dissertation work in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I was looking at the Brazilian Constitutional Assembly, but I was also looking across the world at other constitutions. And it struck me that really what we wanted to do was, in order to get an idea of how ideas and how constitutional ideas emerge and spread, was to consult some sort of data set that had the content of constitutions historically cataloged in a way that somebody could look at them and understand the patterns of similarity among constitutions. Well, surprisingly, that data set didn't exist. And so we embarked upon that in 2005. And since then, we've been operating this project that we call the Comparative Constitutions Project, whose major contribution has been this data set on the content of constitutions across time. We embarked on this project, which is somewhat ambitious, to collect the content of every single constitution that had been written since 1789. So essentially every modern democratic constitution. Another thing that struck us was that constitutions, and this is a really important part of constitutions are not credit card contracts. They're contracts that ordinary people are supposed to understand. And so they don't necessarily need experts coming in and telling them what the Constitution means or should mean. Citizens should be able to read the Constitution and decide for themselves what they mean. So in some ways, what we wanted to do was to put our data and our texts out there in form for everybody to see. Essentially, we wanted to get out of the way and put our data there and allow citizens and drafters in countries to read these texts, analyze them for themselves, and decide what they want in their constitutions. The idea was to have a very simple, beautiful, and functional way to look through a given set of topics and pull out excerpts from a representative set of texts. So I put together a proposal that would do just this and shopped it around. At some point, I got in touch with a few people at Google Ideas who are doing some really interesting things. Their idea is to take some of the, it's called the engineering experience and know-how of Google and apply them to real-world social science problems on the ground in developing countries. And of course, Google knows a little bit about search, and we know a little bit about constitutions, and so it was a nice marriage in some ways. So we put together a team of people from Google Ideas, which is the philanthropic group at Google, a few people from Google itself, who actually lent a lot of their time outside their day jobs. And a lot of the resources from this came from a grant from Google Ideas to the University of Texas, which allowed us to hire a number of really fabulous graduate students at the Department of Government.
I'm Alexander Hudson, one of Zach's grad students here at the Department of Government at the University of Texas. One of the main things that Constitute enables someone to do, as opposed to previous tools, is that you can search for an idea as opposed to just free text. You don't have to search for keywords. You can say, this is a subject in which I'm interested, and put that into the search box. And those tags we've attached to pieces of text will enable you to get those results without necessarily even knowing the word that you're looking for.
My name is Robert Schaefer. I'm a PhD student with Zach Elkins in the Department of Government, working on my doctoral dissertation right now. In Constitute, the project has been around for about 10 years now. We have data on basically every constitution passed in every country in the world since 1789. And the way that those data are formatted is we have variables. So for example, we know that the US Constitution protects the right to free speech, and we have references to the text.
When you go to Constitute, the first thing you see is a very image that we've selected from any number of constitutional settings. And really what we want to do here is be as beautiful as possible, let's put it that way. Because generally when you read through constitutions, it's a generally very grim, depressing, and desultory experience. You sit down in some library, pull out books off the shelf that have never been checked out in 20 years, and you pull some things together. So we want Constitute to be opposite. We want Constitute to be this really fabulous design experience where you go there and have a very simple functional experience. Right now we have constitutions from 188 countries. That's almost all the countries in the world. The last time I checked, we've had visits from 174 countries. In places that are undergoing revision right now, such as Egypt and the Dominican Republic, there's been a fair amount of interest. It's become clear to me that for educators and students, this is a fabulous resource. One thing we want to do is to expand the set of constitutions that are there. So right now we have every current constitution in force for almost every single country. But what we want to do is to push back further in history and include all the other historical documents. Another thing we want to do is to actually put this in the language of citizens from the countries that are writing constitutions. On Constitute right now, you can pin these excerpts and save them later for analysis, but why not make it easier and in some ways more collaborative in that part of the process? So our thought is to take these documents and allow for some annotations and some comments by readers. But the important thing is to allow people to comment on text. and allow you yourself to add your own annotations and your own comments, so that when you go back to these, you can have not only a repository of constitutions, but a repository about your own thoughts on these constitutions. One of the other fronts that I've been pushing in constitutional design is to actually get some resources in the hands of people who are writing collectively. And I've been working on this in some ways with my students. This semester I'm teaching an honors class. It's a Plan 2 class, as we say at Texas. The last month or so before the launch of our website was crunch time, and it was all hands on deck, including our fabulous graduate students at the Department of Government who were working nonstop, it seemed, almost on this project. But we also needed a little more firepower, so the Plan 2 students that are involved in my course on constitutional design lent a hand. They came through with flying colors, these Plan 2 students, and so I think there are at least 10 documents on Constitute that wouldn't be there if it weren't for these Plan 2 students. Ideally, I think what Constitute could and should do is to be a resource for educators, scholars, and drafters. We built it with the idea that drafters would use it, and I think they will. In fact, if I were sitting down and writing a Constitution, I couldn't imagine not writing one without this tool. My ideal is that people spend as little time as possible with the logistics and the mechanics that get in the way of thinking about ideas. And I think that Constitute, because it allows people to work so efficiently in the search and analysis part of constitutional design, will allow people to actually focus on what matters. The University of Texas has been a phenomenal home for Constitute. It's provided all sorts of support, both financially and in engineering capacity. Really, there are all sorts of pockets of knowledge and resource around the University of Texas which have been phenomenally useful. I often quote Danquart Rustow in saying that history is far too important to be left to the historians, and so I think this is another example of that.